We've been talking about the distribution of popularity and the way in which people's attention is distributed very unevenly across items, across books and movies and celebrities and ideas and so forth, because some things command a lot of attention, they're very, very popular, and most things command relatively little attention, right? And that's the extreme imbalance that characterizes the distribution of popularity. Now, the distribution of popularity also plays a huge role in markets that sell media, things like books and songs and movies, and similar kinds of creative work, right? These are all things that amass an audience, that command attention, and hence they're really driven by the kind of imbalances that we see in popularity. And the point in particular is that these kinds of markets contain a complicated mix of blockbusters, things that sell many, many copies, and niche items, right? Large numbers of smaller items that have limited followings, right? Limited number of fans. And thinking about the distribution of popularity will actually help us think about how all of these different types of items interact with each other and form the market. Now, this is a complicated picture, and in 2004, Chris Anderson wrote a hugely influential article, it later became a book, in which he coined a term to describe this ecosystem of popularities and try to bring some clarity to this picture. He referred to it as the long tail, a term that has since become very, very popular itself. And it was based on the following kind of picture. In this picture, we're going to draw a distribution on XY axes that tries to capture how popularity is distributed. It's going to look a bit different from the curves that we drew earlier when we were looking for power laws, but it will actually capture the same information, just sort of presented in a different form. So on the x-axis, we're going to imagine the following, that you're a seller of books and you carry a very, very large inventory, right? So you're an online internet bookseller. And on the x-axis, you have ordered all of your books in order of popularity, right? So the very first thing you encounter as you go out the x-axis is the most popular book that sells the most copies. And the next one is the second most popular book. And you just keep going, and you can go out to, 100,000, a million books, right? And as you go further out the x-axis, they get less and less and less popular. And on the y-axis, we're simply going to say how many copies each of these books sold, right? So the first point up there on the y-axis is going to be how many copies did your most popular book sell, and the next is the second most popular, and so forth. And so it's going to be this downward sloping curve that continues way far out down the x-axis, right? And it falls off pretty fast at first, right? Because you're carrying a few bestsellers that just sell a lot of things, but already by the time you're out to the 20th most popular thing, the 50th most popular thing, you're at much, much lower sales volume. Okay, so in particular, a point on this curve, right? A point that has, say, x coordinate equal to j, y coordinate equal to k, that by definition says the jth most popular book has sold k copies. Now, when we look at this curve, and this was Chris Anderson's argument, we can parse it into the part of the curve that sort of goes out the long arm of the x-axis, and the part of it that climbs up the high side of the y-axis. And this part that goes out the long arm of the x-axis, he referred to as the long tail of popularity. Right? And this sort of comes from this picture of, thinking about this downward sloping curve almost as sort of like a prehistoric reptile emerging out of a swamp, and there's its long tail, and there's correspondingly this big head that rises up at the front, right near the y-axis. Okay, and the point of the long tail is it contains a huge number of items, each of which is individually not very popular, but there sure are just a huge number of them. And of course, at the other end of the curve is what you could call the big head of the distribution, right? That part that climbs way up the y-axis. And in the head of the distribution live a small number of books, in this case, small number of items, but each of them is just extremely popular, right? And so that's a way to sort of parse this sloping curve into two very important aspects of it. The long tail, many items not very popular. The big head, very few items, each of them very, very popular. And if you're a company that sells books, you're in the media business, then an important question you have to ask yourself, and this was the crux of the long tail argument, is where is most of your revenue coming from, right? Is it coming from the big head? Do you make most of your money off selling a few bestsellers to huge numbers of people? Or are you making it off the long tail by selling many things, but each of them to only a few people, right? Either of those is a strategy. And in fact, you could think of different companies could pursue different strategies. One could be a head company that really puts its effort into creating blockbusters. And another could be a tail company, right, that amasses very small followings for a huge number of distinct niche items. And another part of the long tail argument was that marketing to the tail, right, selling all these niche items, becomes much easier if you're amassing an audience online using the internet and the web, because it enables you to assemble a very, very large customer base that's able to find obscure items, and you in turn aren't necessarily maintaining a physical store. You're selling stuff over the internet, so you don't need to carry a very large inventory of any one of these tail items. So in some sense, the fact that we're thinking about the tail and its importance has really been sort of accelerated by the rise of the internet and the web. It's made it much more easy to do business that way. Another key component of the long tail argument is the power of recommendation. So if I think about companies that are actually selling these gigantic numbers of items, right? Amazon selling books, Netflix streaming movies to people over the internet, they're making a lot of money off the tail. And they're driving people to items in the tail using their recommendation systems, right? So Amazon has a recommendation engine that says, if you liked these items or you bought these items, here are some other things you might like. Netflix says, you've watched these movies, you rated them, here are some other things you might like. These aren't just nice features that keep users happy, they're actually essential to the strategy of selling items in the tail. Because when you have a gigantic mass of obscure items, you need to be able to efficiently direct people to the ones that are going to interest them. And that means you're going to need to watch their first few actions on the site, what they liked, what they didn't like, and develop a model of them so that you can then recommend stuff that they're going to like. Without that, they won't be able to find the things in the tail that actually appeal to them, and this whole strategy of marketing to the long tail is not going to work. So all of this is wrapped together, the distribution of popularity and the way in which technologies on the internet, selling things online, and using recommendation, automated recommendation, to steer people toward what they're interested in, makes it much, much easier to actually have a strategy based on selling out in the tail of the popularity distribution. And there's a final point here, of course, which is that items eventually can move sometimes, occasionally, from the tail to the head. An item can start out with sort of just a niche following, and it can amass a very large audience as it becomes more popular. But the point is, often that process is based on certain accidental things that happen very early in the life cycle of the item. Right? It just happens to acquire a few devoted fans who tell their friends. And so in that way, certain accidental things that happen amplify its popularity. And what that means, if it's really based on these accidents, is that popularity has an aspect that's inherently unpredictable. And researchers like Duncan Watts have really promoted this argument in recent years that when we look at these very, very popular items, sometimes we're seeing something that was not at all inevitable, but really the result of these accidental things that happened very early in its life when it was first attracting its first few fans that somehow snowballed into this massive popularity that we now see. So in the end, we see that thinking about the distribution of popularity taps into a number of important issues. It, first of all, is closely related to the rich get richer dynamic by which people imitate each other's decisions, and has implications for the design of markets, markets particularly in settings where the fundamental driving constraint is attention and how it's distributed.